Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mansion House. In case of emergency, please note the fire exits. May we ask you to please make sure your mobile phones and pagers are completely switched off. Due to the solemnity of the evening, we ask you not to applaud during any part of the evening. Thank you.
Our hybrid presentation this evening, with reduced audience capacity, is a reminder of the disruption caused by the COVID pandemic, which is still with us. On this evening of remembrance, the empty spaces remind us of the millions of Jewish people and their communities who were decimated by the Holocaust, leaving a void where once vibrant Jewish life flourished. This evening's Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration is being live-streamed online. Some of the readings have been pre-recorded. Some footage has been used from previous years. Every year, on this evening of commemoration, we solemnly mark Holocaust Memorial Day here in Dublin. We remember 6 million Jewish people murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. And we remember millions of other persecuted minorities who were victims of Nazi atrocities. This evening's ceremony provides us with the opportunity to cherish the memory of those who perished and to reflect on the consequences of the Holocaust. I invite Professor Thomas O'Dowd, Chairperson of Holocaust Education Trust Ireland, to introduce this evening of remembrance.
It is less than a lifetime since the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. It is exactly 80 years since the Wannsee Conference took place in January 1942 at a secluded villa in a suburb of Berlin. At this meeting, 15 Nazis and government officials decided on Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question: the murder of the Jewish people of Europe by poisonous gas. A list showing the number of Jews living in each European country whom the Nazis intended to annihilate was circulated to the delegates. Ireland appears on that list. The Holocaust was unprecedented in history. It was the intent of Nazi Germany to destroy the Jewish people of Europe, their history, their culture, and to murder other people because of their ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs. The Holocaust happened at the core of our civilization, at the heart of our culture, in the midst of societies resembling our own. It was mainly about Jewish people, but there were thousands of other victims. The lessons are universal. Individuals, groups, and governments made choices that legalized discrimination and allowed prejudice and hatred to flourish that would ultimately justify and facilitate mass murder. The fear and uncertainty which prevailed in 1930s Europe nurtured the extremes, which unleashed the cataclysmic disaster on the world that was the Holocaust. It did not emerge spontaneously, but was the result of seeds sown over hundreds of years. Seeds of hatred, seeds of mistrust, seeds of anti-Semitism, and ultimately seeds of evil. With few Holocaust survivors now left to carry the burden of memory, the lessons of history grow dangerously dim. It becomes even more important to educate generations now living. we urge second and third generation survivors and all young people in our midst to speak out against the surge in misinformation, the increase in anti-Semitism, and the prevalence of Holocaust denial and distortion. Awareness of the Holocaust strengthens our resolve to rebut anti-Semitism in all its manifestations and to commit ourselves to challenging every example of intolerance that we witness.
I invite the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Alison Gilliland, to welcome you.
On behalf of the city and people of Dublin, it's a great honour to host this important national event, which is held every year in the Round Room at the Mansion House. We feel privileged to be here among survivors of the Holocaust and descendants of the survivors who have made Dublin and Ireland their home. Holocaust Memorial Day marks the date of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on the 27th of January 1945. Less than a lifetime since the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. Tonight we recall the suffering inflicted on the Jewish people of Europe and on those of other faiths and ethnicities, those with disabilities, those from the LGBT+ community, and those with other political beliefs, persecuted during the Holocaust. We will reflect on this and on the suffering still being inflicted on people throughout the world today. We acknowledge the work of the Holocaust Education Trust in Ireland in its endeavours to educate and inform about the Holocaust and ensure that this dark page of history is never denied or distorted, but always remembered. Thank you.
I invite President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to address us.
A hailse ardhuire bolio clia Ian Iliog, fellow guests, do fir ginohus haram new. I welcome this opportunity to be with you all here today as we mark National Holocaust Memorial Day. May I thank the Holocaust Education Trust for its invitation and the Lord Mayor of Dublin for hosting this important event. May I begin by saying how honoured we are to have Holocaust survivors Susie Diamond, Tommy Rickenthal and Joe Veselski with us today. Their presence and words are so important in bringing us closer and helping us to bear witness to the depravity to which humanity was brought and sank during Nazi Germany, that nadir of human existence which we now refer to as the Holocaust. The personal recollections of survivors, deeply painful as they are for them, remind us of the millions of individual stories, all of which together make up the collective experience of the Shoah. Families torn from each other, deaths suffered, some witnessed, others in solitary conditions. We think of the monument to hate that the Holocaust is and what it teaches us of how hate of the other is generated, sustained intergenerationally, tolerated, made possible by the indifference of those who should have cared, and how such indifference can have such consequences. Thus, on a day like this, it is so appropriate to recall the bravery, generosity of spirit, tenacity, and great will to survive, which are also a central part of the Holocaust event we are sharing. It is now 77 years since celebration of Auschwitz-Birkenau, that complex of over 40 concentration and extermination camps operated by Nazi Germany in occupied Poland. We know now that the Nazis and their allies ran more than 44,000 camps, ghettos, and other sites of detention, persecution, forced labor, and murder during the Holocaust. Our horror of their existence, as we recall, may move us, but we must never forget the deeper challenge of asking, how did it come to be? What indifference, beyond any earlier manipulation of ignorance and hate, allowed it to become the horror that we commemorate? Yes, more than 3/4 of a century on, the visible signs of all of the destruction of World War II may have largely been erased from the rebuilt cities and towns of Europe. Fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors now remain to tell us directly their stories with each passing year, as we move further away in time from the events of that darkest period of history. It becomes ever more important that we understand the obligation that lies on all of us to recall and seek to unravel the ideas, words, and pieces of communication that led to that chapter in our relatively recent history, its consequences, and crucially what we must learn from it. It would be a heinous error to consign the Holocaust or the lessons that should be learned from it to a past that is now assumed no longer to have any relevance in our contemporary circumstances. It does. It challenges us to identify and confront hate speech. As we reflect with solemnity on this dark chapter of our shared European history, a number of important questions arise. How should we best remember the Holocaust in an ethical manner? How can we ensure that its history is not forgotten? Ask ourselves, as to what extent can any memorial, other than to convert a commitment to never forget into a commitment to end hate speech, what can best assist us in truly comprehending the experiences of victims of the Holocaust? It is important as to how we symbolize the enormity of the atrocity that is the Holocaust, the vast number of its victims, while still honoring each unique life that was lost. The schoolchild, the brother, the aunt, the shopkeeper, the chemist. All of this must challenge us. Questions such as how can the Jewish people and all the minorities sent to the camps in the Holocaust be represented inclusively and recalled appropriately? I suggest that these are all important questions that will benefit from ongoing consideration and public discussion. There are many ways in which individuals, groups, and nations in Germany and around the world have sought to confront the memory of the Holocaust. Some countries have made Holocaust denial a crime, punishable by imprisonment or a fine. Some governments have encouraged or mandated education about the Holocaust. Scholars, journalists, survivors, and novelists have helped the public remember the Holocaust through their writing. When Holocaust survivor and author Elie Wiesel was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, the chairman of the Nobel Committee remarked, "Through his books, Elie Wiesel has given us not only an eyewitness account of what happened, but also an analysis of the evil powers which lay behind the events in more recent times and close to home." As part of the Crocus Project, Sabina and I planted yellow crocus bulbs at the Art in Nuchtron last October. We were joined by a group of children to remember the 1.5 million Jewish children who suffered and perished in the Holocaust, and the thousands of other children who were victims of Nazis' atrocities. Those crocuses are now beginning to bloom. Yet in the 10 years since I first spoke at the Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration here in Dublin, it is profoundly worrying to witness the trend of the emergence and rise of extremist language and politics across the streets of Europe and beyond. Rhetoric that seeks to exploit what is often a loss of trust, but much more frequently informs a presentation of the other that invokes fear, exclusion, and rejection. As anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, homophobia, and intolerance are once again on the rise in parts of Europe and many parts of the world, We must, as we remember the Holocaust collectively, ensure the lessons it taught the world so cruelly are heard and understood. And we must work together to ensure that hatred and inhumanity of anti-migrant feeling, for example, are not allowed to spread their dark shadow across Europe and the world. Dwindling Holocaust knowledge as part of a dangerous amnesia to past atrocities and to the sources of hatred is driving global anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. This is why it is vital that awareness of the Holocaust must examine all of the forces of hate, exclusion, and collusive silences that gave rise to fascism in Europe in the 1930s. Why it should be part of the history curriculum across Europe and elsewhere to truly learn, to internalize the necessary gains from attention to the lessons of history. We must ensure as new generations emerge and their world ostensibly becomes further removed in measured time from the horrors of the Holocaust, that they too can learn from the consequences of actions and inactions of those who by their culpable indifference, their averted gaze, allowed it to happen, who participated in it, who facilitated it. As Hannah Arendt put it so well, evil thrives on apathy and cannot survive without it. We must ensure that every generation appreciates the shelter that a shared commitment to international law provides for us all, of the limitless enriching possibilities na féidir ansóran that can be achieved from a shared humanity practiced with responsibility and cooperation. In doing so, we can achieve an empowering ethical remembrance that may even allow for the possibility of an emancipatory future, one that is alert to the rise of racism and the rhetoric of hatred, but continues to foster a commitment to plant the seeds of a better future on the soil of a bitter past, seeds that will grow into the strength to value and uphold democracy, human dignity, liberty, equality, and the irreducible, inseparable, indivisible rights of our common humanity. Kristallnacht.
Signed in January 2000, the Stockholm Declaration is an international intergovernmental agreement between countries committing them to commemorating and educating about the Holocaust. Mr. Roderick O'Gorman, Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, will read an extract from that important document.
We, the governments attending the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, recognise that it was a tragically defining episode of the 20th century, a crisis for Europe and a universal catastrophe. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. After more than half a century, it remains an event close enough in time that survivors can still bear witness to the horrors that engulfed the Jewish people. The terrible suffering of millions of Jewish people and other victims of the Nazis has left an indelible stain across Europe that must forever be seared in our collective memory. The selfless sacrifices of those who defied the Nazis and sometimes gave their own lives to protect or rescue Holocaust victims must also be inscribed in our hearts. We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education, remembrance, and research about the Holocaust in our schools, universities, communities, and other institutions. With humanity still scarred by anti-Semitism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, racism, xenophobia, and other expressions of hatred, we commit to fight against these evils and to reaffirm our common aspiration for a democratic and tolerant society free of prejudice and other forms of bigotry.
handful of Jewish Holocaust survivors live in Ireland. All of them were children during the time of the Holocaust, and all of them found their way to Ireland by different means. Each of them lost many family members in the Shoah, and each has his or her own personal tale of survival. Tommy Reichenthal came to Ireland in 1959, where he married and raised his family. For 50 years, he didn't speak about his Holocaust experiences.
I'm here today not because who I am, but because what I am. I am a Jew and I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. I was born in Slovakia in 1935. I was just 9 years old when I was captured by the Nazis along with my mother, brother, grandmother, aunt, and cousin. We were herded into cattle cart, and from that moment onwards, we were treated worse than animals. There was no privacy or hygiene. The stench and condition were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 nights, the cattle train stopped. The doors were opened, and we were greeted by the shouts from the SS with gun pointing and barking dogs. We had arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was there from November 1944 until the liberation of the camp in April 1945. What I witnessed as a 9-year-old boy is impossible to describe. The starvation, the cruelty of the camp guard, the cold, disease. People who were just skin and bone and looked like living skeletons were walking around very slowly, some of them dropping to the ground, never to get up again. They were dying in their hundreds, their emaciated bodies left where they fell or thrown into heaps. In front of our barracks, there were piles of decomposing corpses. For many prisoners in Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were too much to bear, and they threw themselves on the barbed wire at night to be shot in order to put an end to their misery. We found the corpses there in the morning. 70,000 prisoners of Bergen-Belsen are buried there in mass graves. I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust.
I invite youth reader Peter O'Neill to tell us about the book burnings and boycotts of 1933.
The book burnings and boycotts of Jewish businesses and professions that took place throughout Germany in April and May 1933 heralded the introduction of further anti-Jewish measures by the Nazis. Jewish religious books, books by Jewish authors, and books about Jews were condemned as degenerate and burned in public bonfires, along with other books and works by authors considered to be un-German. Boycotts of Jewish businesses and professions were imposed. Jews were no longer employed in academia, the military, or the media.
I invite Jerry Cunningham, Director of the Human Rights Unit at the Department of Foreign Affairs, to tell us about the Nuremberg Laws. Youth reader Sean Toohey will read about exclusion.
The Nuremberg Laws, drawn up in 1935, were designed to make Jewish people disappear from German society. Jews were deprived of their German citizenship. Jewish people were prohibited from marrying or having relationships with non-Jewish Germans. This law was soon extended to include Roma, black people, and other ethnic minorities. For the first time, Jews were defined as a race. As restrictions tightened, Jews found it increasingly difficult to earn a living. They were no longer able to work in the civil service, in academia, or in the media. Jewish businesses were appropriated by the Nazi state, and Jewish banks and bank accounts held by Jews were confiscated. The Nuremberg Laws disenfranchised Jews and deprived them of most of their civil rights and their human rights.
Exclusion. Jews were forbidden from public places such as cinemas, theaters, cafes, ice rinks, swimming pools, or public parks where benches had "Not for Jews" stenciled onto them. Jews were not allowed to participate in sports or ride on trams, keep pets, or own radios or bicycles. Increasingly, Jewish people were excluded from German society.
By July 1938, as pressure increased on Jews to leave Germany and German-occupied lands, hundreds of thousands tried to flee. Anticipating a Jewish refugee crisis, President Roosevelt convened a conference in France to discuss offering refuge to Jewish people. I invite Evelyn Byrne, Director of the Irish Refugee Protection Programme, to give her reading.
"32 countries were represented at the Evian Conference, including Ireland. Delegates were asked if they would accept Jewish refugees. Most countries said they had no room for Jewish refugees. Most said their quotas were already full. One country even stated that no Jew is too many. With nowhere to turn, Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders. In October 1938, the Nazis expelled some 17,000 Polish-born Jews from Germany. They languished on the German-Polish border in the area of Gibeson in very harsh living conditions. They were not welcome in Germany. They were not welcome in Poland. Today, people are fleeing discrimination, persecution, tyranny, and war. These people are desperate to find refuge. They are desperately seeking from us somewhere safe to build new lives.
The state-sanctioned violence of the November pogrom in 1938 marked a turning point in Nazi persecution of Jewish people. I invite Karina Camerino to give her reading.
The November pogrom known as Kristallnacht erupted across Germany and Austria as the SS, Nazi police, Hitler Youth, and locals rampaged through the streets on that November night. Hundreds of synagogues, Jewish schools, and businesses were destroyed and set ablaze. Windows were smashed, leaving the streets strewn with glass. Over 1,000 Jews were beaten to death, and some 30,000 Jewish men were thrown into concentration camps. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and thousands of apartments and shops belonging to Jewish people were looted. After the destruction, the Jewish communities were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks to pay for the damage. After years of official harassment of Jews in Nazi Germany, the state-sanctioned violence of Kristallnacht marked the acceleration of Jewish persecution that would ultimately culminate in the Holocaust.
Everyone in Germany was required to carry identity papers, but special identifying marks were added to those of Jewish people. A large letter J was stamped on their passports, and the middle names of Sarah for females and Israel for males were introduced. In Poland, blue stars of David on white armbands were made compulsory, and in most countries under Nazi control, Jews were forced to wear yellow stars of David on their outer clothing. I invite youth reader Dragos Kazan to read from the diary of 15-year-old Yitzhak.
The decree was issued that the Vilna Jewish population must put on badges front and back. I was ashamed to appear in them on the street, not because it would be noticed that I am a Jew, but because I was ashamed of what they were doing to us. I was ashamed of our helplessness.
More than 1,000 ghettos were created throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. I invite Alex Margalit and Aoife Sheridan to give their readings.
Jews, Roma, communists, homosexuals, and political opponents of the regime were incarcerated in the Nazi ghettos, which were created in every country occupied by the Germans. More than 1 million people died in them. The Nazi ghettos were places of incarceration, brutality, and starvation. Lack of hygiene and overcrowding led to thousands of deaths from disease. It suited the Nazis if they could claim that people in the ghettos were dying from natural causes. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and inmates who left them without permission were severely punished, often shot. The inhabitants of the ghettos soon realized that their eventual fate would be death. Although there are heroic stories of resistance, most of the ghetto populations were murdered, and there were few survivors.
We are here 5 days, but it seems like 5 years. First, the fence was finished, and nobody can go out or come in. And on every house, they posted a notice which tells us exactly what we are allowed to do. Actually, everything is forbidden, but the most awful thing is that the punishment for everything is death. It doesn't actually say that this punishment also applies to children, but I think it does apply to us too.
There were hundreds of concentration camps, slave camps, and transit camps throughout the territories of the Third Reich. Jews and others incarcerated in these camps were worked or beaten to death or perished from brutality, exhaustion, cold, hunger, or disease. In June 1941, the German army invaded Russia and the Eastern Territories. It was followed by special killing units tasked with killing Jews in all the towns and villages they passed through. The killing squads were made up of Nazis, SS, police officers, members of the German army, and hundreds of local collaborators. They rounded up Jews in shetels, towns, and villages, forcing them into cemeteries, forests, and ravines where they were murdered in their thousands at point-blank range. Many had to dig mass graves before being shot into them. Entire Jewish communities, totaling some 2 million Jews as well as other victims, were annihilated in this method of face-to-face killing. Word was sent back to Berlin that some members of the killing squads found their work distressing. They asked head office to find a more efficient way of murdering Jews. And so the Wannsee Conference was convened on the 20th of January, 1942. I invite Martin Fraser, Secretary General of the Department of the Taoiseach, to tell us about the meeting.
Reinhard Heydrich, Chief of the Reich Security Main Office, summoned 15 delegates to a meeting in a lakeside villa at Wannsee outside Berlin. He asked them to endorse Hitler's plans to introduce mechanisms for the total annihilation of the Jewish people of Europe. Eichmann presented the delegates with a list of the number of Jews living in each European country who the Nazis intended to murder. Ireland appears on the list with a total of 4,000 Jews. The delegates debated who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement, which were euphemisms for murder. They concluded that a more efficient method of killing was possible, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killing. In less than 2 hours, the delegates gave their unanimous support for the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of the Jewish people by poison gas.
As a consequence of the Wannsee Conference, 6 purpose-built death camps were established, all of them on Polish soil, where approximately 3 million Jews and thousands of other victims were murdered in gas chambers. Prisoners were selected to live or to die. 90% were selected to die. They were ushered into undressing areas where they were told to leave their clothes neatly on the numbered pegs and to tie their shoes together to make them easier to find when they came back from the showers. They never came back. Their clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were sorted and sold in markets back in Germany. Human hair was used in the manufacture of textiles. This systematic industrial process of murder was unprecedented in human history. I invite Heather Abrahamson to tell us about Ireland and the Wannsee list.
The inclusion of Ireland in the Wannsee list is significant for the Irish Jewish community today, of which I am a member. It is understood that the list was drawn from records available at the time. Had the Nazis defeated the Allies, it is likely they would have reached Ireland, and the vast majority of Irish Jews would have been murdered. My parents were married in Dublin 1 year after the Wannsee Conference took place, and many of their relatives and friends attended their wedding. If the Nazis had succeeded in their plans, and won the war, my parents, as well as my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, would have been caught up in the Nazi terror. Their children and grandchildren, the very same people who are currently living members of the Jewish community today, would probably not exist.
Kitty Hart-Moxon from Poland was 16 years old when she was imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She still talks about her experiences. Youth reader Aisling Matthews will read from Kitty's own words.
As evening came, the whole sky was red. Smoke and flames were pouring out of all the chimneys. Here were the death factories. Today, in 2022, it is barely credible to someone like myself, who lived through the worst of it, that members of a younger generation cannot believe it happened at all. But I did live through it, and I do know what happened. I was there.
The Holocaust was unprecedented in its planning, execution, and in its intent to destroy an entire people, its culture, and its history. Leonard Abrahamson, President of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, will give his reading.
The final solution was a systematic intent by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jew in every country of Europe, stretching as far north as Norway, as far south as Rhodes, as far east as Russia, and as far west as Ireland. They also included those Jews living in countries of North Africa. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of those victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims. But as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims.
We must prevent future generations from thinking of the Holocaust in terms of anonymous, faceless numbers. Every victim has a name. Several people living in Ireland lost cherished family members in the Holocaust, whose names we have included in the scroll of names. For some of them, we know their place of birth, their country of origin, their age, and their place of death. For others, we have only their names, and these are included in the scroll. In this small way, we honor their memory and give them a personal Irish memorial. I invite readers from BBYO Youth Organisation and from 35th Dublin Scout Group to read from the scroll of names.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gisela Molnar, Sander Molnar, Baila Hirschberg, Matthias Hirschberg, Rukla Orzel, Feivel Orzel, Slasma Urbach, Hirsch Urbach, Tauba Urbach, David Joseph Urbach, Shaul Urbach, Abe Zvi Urbach,
Rukla Golda
Hitler
Urbach,
Freyla Urbach,
Sarah Urbach,
Leah Fegla Urbach,
Giel Urbach,
Nachim Mordechai Urbach,
Simon Urbach, Nuchim Urbach, Fegla Urbach, Perla Urbach, Freimeta Urbach, Moses Klein, Hilda Frankel, Kurt Frankel, Walter Frankel, Herbert Frankel, Fritz Frankel, Zygmunt Frankel,
Martin Wolf,
Solomon Dumont,
Wolfgang Wolf,
Caroline Wolf,
Sally Wolf, Henrietta Wolf, Rosetta Wolf, Eli Wevel Avisansky, David Philip, Recha Philip, Leopold Philip, Julia Philip, Dagbert Philip, Louis Philip of Minsk, Valeria Philip, Rosalia Shemovitz, Julius Mayer,
Adela Fried,
Geza Suri,
Bella Fried,
Oskar Shemovich,
Katerina Fried, Agnes Fried, Ezekiel Reichenthal, Katerina Reichenthal, Kalmar Reichenthal, Ilona Reichenthal, Gita Reichenthal, Ibi Reichenthal, Jacinda Reichenthal, Ferdinand Alt, Renka Alt, Erna Albert, Marta Albert,
Paul Drexler,
Joseph Drexler,
Meda Drexler,
Bedriska
Bella
Drexler,
Perlberg, Emma Popper, Yura Mataya, Ivisha Mataya, Anshika Mataya, Kalman Rosenthal, Eleonora Rosenthal, Abraham Sustiel, Pauline Sustiel, David Sustiel, Shimon Sustiel, Regina Sustiel, Rapay Sustiel,
Lucy Sostiel,
Marta Sustiel,
Moshe Yom Tov
Shabbatai
Sostiel,
Sustiel,
Adela Sostiel, Agdeni Sostiel Brudo, Emmanuel Brudo, Sostiel children, Heinrich Heinbach, Selma Heinbach, Simcha Zaks, Rivka Zaks, Beryl Zaks, Ziv Zaks, Nachman Zaks, Chana Zaks, Aaron Zaks, Chana Sherhai,
Bandit Zaks,
Joel Dov
Ziad
Zaks,
Sadak, Gito Zaks, Shoshana Zaks, Shayna Zaks, Masha Zaks, Rosa Zaks, Tyler Feig Faklil, David Mayer Faklil,
Yocheved Vak,
Moshe Faklil,
Chaim Shem
Gayla
Mikla,
Faklil,
Nutsin Nut
Shanda
Fakla,
Milkman,
Esther
Yechel
Zak
Milkman,
Yabuta,
Theo Milkman,
Levi Fak,
Joseph
Izzy
Milkman,
Fakla,
Happy Gerzib,
Nathan
Chaim
Fakla,
Milkman,
Johanna Skyberg Sona, Etty Steinberg, Leon Glock, Wojciech Glock, Bella Abram, Osia Yosem Abram,
Ida Cohn, Heinrich Herbst, Caroline Herbst, Elsa Zimak, Denny Zimak, Abraham Humberg, Emma Humberg, Gerda Feist, Fanny Kaufman, Adolf Humberg, Raphael German, Karl German, David German, Hannah Matla Zibner, Rivka Zibner,
Zolam
Baby Zibner, Mindla Zibner,
Franla Zibner, daughter of Franla Zibner, Shainla Zibner, Joseph Zibner, Mendel Kersner, Shaina Bela Kersner, Ovsei Kersner, Shaina Riva Kersner, Shifra Kersner, Rash Kersner, Yankel Kersner, Wanda Camarino, Renato Dicori, Italo Camarino, Julia Dicori,
Mayor Naftulovic,
Miriam Naptulovic,
Sidonia Naftulovicova, Hani Moskovicova, Chaim Moskovich, Benjamin Moskovich, Moritz Moskovich, Isidore Moskovich, Shimshon Hertz, Kayla Hertz, Scheindel Hertz, Abraham Hertz, Rosa Hertz, Joseph Hertz, Lieb Hertz, Mayor Rashofsky, Rachel Rashofsky, Kayla Rashofsky, Hirsch Rashofsky,
Grunia Cherchkov, Max Koktoff, Michaela Koktoff, Sioma Koktoff, Devora Krosnick, Miriam Krosnick, Henna Krosnick, Fega Krosnick, Annie Otten Wolf, David Galassin, Jeanette Galassin, Paul Tama, Sarah Tama, Isaac Shishi, Ephraim Sachs, Lena Sachs.
Liberation was not always joyful for the survivors of the Holocaust, especially Jewish survivors who had lost everything, their families and their homes. Most had no one left and nowhere to go. I invite Oscar Hollingsworth to give his reading.
I was lying wrapped in my blanket in the block. Someone else was looking out of the window, and I heard him say in Yiddish, "An American soldier." I didn't move. I lay there. The feeling cannot be described. You would have to make up a new word. I've done it. But then I thought, who has survived? I alone. My father had just died. My sister and my mother were gone. I covered my head and I wept. That was the moment of my liberation.
Dr. Bob Collis worked as a volunteer doctor in the former Bergen-Belsen concentration camp immediately after the war. He brought 6 orphans back with him to Ireland. Among those children were brother and sister Tibor and Susie Molnar, who Bob arranged to have adopted by a Jewish couple, Willie and Elsie Samuels. Susie has pre-recorded her story for this evening's commemoration.
I was born Susie Molnar in a small town of Karjak in Hungary in 1942. We were a small family comprising my mother, Gisela, my father, Sandor, my brother, Terry, and myself. In 1942, my father was forcibly conscripted into the slave labor service of the Hungarian army and deported to the Soviet Union, where he perished in 1943. In July 1944, in just 8 weeks, Adolf Eichmann organized the roundup and deportation of nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews. The majority of them were sent directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where most of them perished in the gas chambers. Some were sent to other concentration camps. During these weeks, the Gestapo came for my mother, brother, and me. We were deported first to Ravensbrück and then to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. My mother died shortly after liberation. Terry and I were very young children when we came to Ireland. We grew up believing we were the only 2 members of our family to have survived. In 2007, Terry passed away, and I was the only one left. But things changed unexpectedly in 2015 when I was discovered by a first cousin still living in Karjak, and I learned a little about my family. My father was one of 4 brothers who ran a timber business. 2 of them perished in the Holocaust and 2 survived. I have also learned that I have first cousins living in Hungary and the United States. I have a family. I have visited Karjak and seen my grandfather's house, the Jewish cemetery where my grandparents are buried, and the synagogue where all my family prayed. 778 Jews lived in Karjak before the war. 461 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. Most important for me is the memorial scroll on the synagogue wall, recording the Jews from Karjak who perished in the Holocaust. My family is listed on this scroll, but this has to be corrected because my brother and I were not murdered. We survived. I am mindful that time is passing too quickly for my contemporaries and for me. What we experienced took place in the middle of the last century, far too distant for young people today to understand the enormity of what happened. 6 million Jews murdered because of their faith, more than the population of Ireland. I urge young people to speak out about hate speech, about bullying, and about Holocaust denial. I implore them to tell our story and to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive.
There are thousands of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. They carry the history of their families on their shoulders. I invite Emma Zinn Collis to give her reading.
Survivors of the Holocaust have very few relations. We've gotten used to having very small families, at least from one side. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, no cousins. We have been endowed with the title second or third generation. And this brings with it an important responsibility to transmit the memory of the Holocaust to future generations. But we can also rejoice in our own lives, in our own families, our children, and our grandchildren. Hitler did not win. One or both parents or grandparents survived. And we are here, living our lives, looking towards the future.
In 1963, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Authority in Israel, inaugurated the award of Righteous Among the Nations to honor non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. I invite Yvonne Altman O'Connor to give her reading.
The righteous come from all walks of life and backgrounds. Individuals, groups of friends, families, organizations, and diplomats. There were nations such as Denmark, Bulgaria, and Albania. There were also righteous Germans, righteous Arabs, and righteous Muslims. Mary Elmes is the first Irish person to be awarded the righteous title. Working with her colleagues in the south of France, she succeeded in saving many Jewish children from the Nazis. Not only those Jews who have been personally saved by the righteous owe them their lives, but all of the descendants do too.
Thousands of Jewish Holocaust survivors made their homes in Israel after the Second World War. I invite Ambassador of Israel, Liron Bar-Sadeh, to tell us about the close connection between Israel and the Shoah.
After the Second World War, thousands and thousands of Jewish Holocaust survivors made their way to the newly established State of Israel. They called themselves She'erit HaPlita in Hebrew, which means the spared remnant. After such great suffering, witnessing the murder and decimation of the families and their communities, the survivors gradually built new lives for themselves. They created new generations of their families in their ancient homeland, where they felt secure and where they felt safe.
Genocides have taken place over the centuries and still occur to this day. I invite Robert Gerwith, Professor of Modern History at UCD, to give his reading.
The Holocaust is the name given to one specific case of genocide that was unprecedented in its totality. The attempt to destroy the Jewish people of Europe and all traces of Jewish culture, history, and memory. By the end of the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered in ghettos, mass shootings, concentration camps, and death camps. The genocide of the Roma took place during the Holocaust, as did the murder of thousands of others who were victims of Nazi atrocities. In all cases of genocide, people have been targeted because of their ethnicity, religious beliefs, or political affiliations. In the 20th century, some of the genocides that took place were in Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, and Bosnia, where more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were massacred in Srebrenica in 1995. Genocides continue to be perpetrated in our world today. Genocide is not a single event in time, but a gradual process that begins when discrimination, racism, and hatred are not checked. It is up to all of us to respect one another, and when we see injustice, we speak out.
Anastasia quickly will tell us about the challenges of anti-Semitism that we face today.
After the devastation of the Holocaust, which left 2/3 of the Jewish people of Europe murdered and their culture and history on the brink of oblivion, it was hard to imagine that Jewish life could be rebuilt on that troubled soil. Yet, that is what happened over decades in a more united Europe. Reconciliation replaced mistrust, and those same nations began a process of critical self-examination, acknowledging the role that they and their citizens played in the Holocaust. It was this process, as much as the improving economic conditions, that restored European Jews' sense of confidence. Most European states have come to terms with their past, but can they handle the present? Today, Jews are being attacked in the streets, in synagogues, and their homes. Leaders of Jewish communities are urging their members, for safety's sake, not to wear their kippah in public. Armed police or military guards patrol in front of synagogues. In Jewish schools and Jewish institutions in a number of European countries. Hungarian Jews watch a populist government honor fascist-era leaders complicit in the crimes of the Holocaust. The rise in the number of white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements is gaining traction around the world. Social media is providing an easy conduit for fomenting racism and hate speech, and vile images providing platforms where extremist rhetoric becomes legitimate. The more this language is repeated, and the more it seeps into the national discourse, the more it becomes acceptable and mainstreamed. Daubings on shop windows in synagogues are all too reminiscent of Kristallnacht, which left property belonging to Jews destroyed, synagogues burnt, and Jewish people murdered. Remembering that genocidal tragedy of the Holocaust in the last century leads us to address the many challenges we face in the present one. public declarations and acts of anti-Semitism are still hateful, prejudiced, and wrong. They must be called out for what they are, and whenever and wherever they are manifested, as must all manifestations of racism.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for 1 minute silence. Thank you. It is customary at Holocaust Memorial events to light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jewish people who perished in the Shoah. In Ireland, we also light candles in memory of all of the victims of Nazi atrocities. The T4 euthanasia program was the mass murder and forced sterilization of thousands of people with disabilities and disabling conditions. I invite Gary Carney of Disability Federation of Ireland to light his candle. We will always remember. Ethnic minorities, Poles and other Slavic peoples were murdered, displaced, forcibly sterilized, and incarcerated in concentration camps. I invite Stuart Dunn of Scouting Ireland to light a candle in memory of Józef Bukowski, who was murdered in the Holocaust. We will always remember. The genocide of the Roma took place during the Holocaust, when more than 250,000 Roma people were murdered. I invite Gabby Muntian of the Roma Community Support Group at Pave Point to light her candle. We will always remember. Thousands of gay men were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps, where they were subjected to harder work, less food, and greater brutality than other inmates. Thousands were put to death. Lesbians were identified as asocials and treated as common criminals. I invite Councillor Alan Edge to light his candle. We will always remember. Nazis persecuted and murdered thousands of political opponents, some for what they did, some for what they refused to do, and some for what they were. I invite Kim Bielenberg, whose maternal grandfather, Fritz Dietloff von der Schulenberg, participated in the July plot to assassinate Hitler, to light his candle. We will always remember. The Nazis persecuted and murdered Catholics, Protestants, and others of Christian affiliation. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted for refusing to salute Hitler or serve in the German army. I invite Father Alan O'Sullivan, chaplain at Trinity College Dublin, to light his candle. we will always remember. Six candles are dedicated to the memory of the 6 million Jewish people, including 1.5 million children, who were annihilated in the Holocaust. Jews were murdered in concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps. Jews perished in the ghettos. Jews died of starvation and disease. Jews were shot in the forests and in their villages, and Jews were murdered in the streets and in their homes. Those lighting candles in memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, second and third generation. All of them lost countless members of their families in the Holocaust. Tony Collis, whose grandfather Zoltan Zinn and great-aunt Edith survived Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Shelley Weinberger, whose grandparents Martin and Malvina Weinberger survived the Shoah, but members of the Vogel and Glick families were murdered, and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Yoram Tokar, whose great-uncle David, Aunt Jeanette Galassin, Paul and Sarah Talma, and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Eniko Toth, whose great-grandfather Mano Weinberger, his mother, sisters, and cousins were murdered in Auschwitz, and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Jonathan Phillips, whose father Jeffrey escaped Germany on the Kinder transports, but whose many other family members perished in the Holocaust. Kyla Herz, whose grandfather Wolf Herz escaped the massacre in the Bronica forest, and whose great-grandparents Lenke and Avrum Muskovich survived Auschwitz, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. We will always remember. Professor Thomas O'Dowd, Chairperson, Holocaust Education Trust Ireland, will give his closing remarks.
The Holocaust was intended not to have any witnesses. The Nazi plan was to erase an entire people from the history and memory of the world. The Jews were not supposed to survive. Everything was planned, thought out, and organized so as not to leave any evidence of the murderous project. The existence of the gas chambers was kept hidden like a state secret. The Nazi death machine was designed to eradicate not only Jews, Roma, and other peoples, but also evidence of their annihilation. It was the survivors themselves who first acknowledged their responsibility for passing on knowledge of the Holocaust and keeping its memory alive. For this reason, it is essential to teach about the Shoah, whether there are Jews in your respective countries or not, whether there are many or few or none left. The Shoah should never be diluted, denied, distorted, or trivialized. Our generation and the generation or two after us will be the last that will be able to say that we stood and touched the hands of some of those who survived. Go home from this place. Tell your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that today you looked into the eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic events ever unleashed by mankind upon mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered and still talked about and still wept over 1,000 years from now. The Holocaust happened, and it can happen again, and every one of us has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever occurs again.
Our ceremony draws to a close, with Rabbi Lent reading the prayer for the repose of the souls of the departed, followed by Carl Nelken chanting the prayer in Hebrew. Please stand.
O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the sheltering wings of your divine presence, among the holy and pure who shine like the brightness of the firmament, for the souls of all the holy and pure and innocent who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled at the hands of the Nazi oppressors in Auschwitz, Belzec, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and other concentration and death camps in Europe. We now pray for those souls. May their resting places be in the Garden of Eden, and so may the Master of Mercy shelter them for eternity with the cover of his wings, and may he bind their souls in a bond of eternal life. May the Lord be their inheritance, and may they repose in peace upon their heavenly resting places. And let us say amen.
Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this evening of solemn commemoration.